I'd like to do a very quick introduction, Alice, if that's okay, and then I'll pass it on to you. Great. Thank you so much. It seems like a great crowd. We have so many prominent scholars from all around the world, as well as students. I'm so happy to see them here. Today we have Dr. Alice Evans from King's College and Harvard, who does some very exciting and novel research on gender. She has a very novel and interdisciplinary approach to gender, and we're all, I guess, looking forward to hear what she's going to tell us about why the Middle East and North Africa is so patriarchal. Let me, for the first timers, let me explain the format of the seminars. It will be about a 1-hour talk with clarification questions. If you have questions during the talk, you can also type them on the chat screen, and I'll try to convey them to Alice. And then we're going to have, I'm sure, a very lively Q&A session at the end, where we can all engage in very nice discussions. So Alice, welcome virtually, and thank you so much again for accepting our invitation for the contemporary debates, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah. Okay. First of all, I should say, contrary to appearances, I'm not in a prison cell. But if you don't believe me, maybe you should ask some questions at the end to check if it's really me, right? Okay. So I think the big question, which I want your thoughts on, is why is the Middle East and North Africa so patriarchal? In fact, it's the most patriarchal region in the world. Because, of course, and I know people are, just to anticipate the question, there is great heterogeneity, right? Marrakesh, Beirut, Istanbul are far more liberal than Cairo and Qom. That said, every single country in the Middle East and North Africa has lower female employment and lower political leadership than the global average. Why is that? Oh my God, this is embarrassing. I just realized that I need to plug this in. It's dying. Bear with me, bear with me. That was a terrible faux pas. That was a terrible faux pas. I need to plug this in. Sorry. This is going badly. I had not anticipated that my laptop would die on me. This is, just bear with me. Damn it. 2 seconds. Sorry, 2 seconds. And then unexpected place here. Okay, we're back in action. Right. I'm back. I apologize. Okay, right.
Okay, no problem.
You're with me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. Right, so I left you on the cliffhanger. That the Middle East and North Africa is super patriarchal, and why is that? So let me go through some common explanations. So when I talk to my Turkish friends, this is something Hassan and I have discussed this. Well, childcare is very expensive, and that's absolutely true. Private care is expensive and public funding is meager. If you compare Turkey to Greece and Italy, public spending on public care is much lower. That said, even among Turkish women who are childless, employment remains low. The second common idea, popularized by Michael Ross, is oil wealth. But, and I can send you a link, even if there is a giant oil discovery in a highly Muslim country, female labor force participation only falls by 2 percentage points over 10 years. So oil ain't it. Okay, what about colonialism? So many people blame colonialism for women's status, and I'm sympathetic. Development generally leads to female emancipation, and imperialism has certainly inhibited development and democratization. No question, absolutely. That said, female seclusion was the norm across the Middle East long before colonialism, and it remains far more pervasive in the region than in other countries with similar wealth. So colonialism cannot be a complete explanation. Okay, what about the desert for all the geographical determinists in the room? Well, we were just speaking about Nathan Nunn. Nathan Nunn has a new paper showing that pastoralism is associated with honor cultures, and Anke Becker, his student, shows it is associated with seclusion. Sure, but there is still unexplained variation. And most Arabs have been farmers. And in this very same geography, in ancient Egypt, women once socialized freely with scant concern for virginity, and especially in the Old Kingdom, they commanded respect as priestesses to the cults of female goddesses. So what happened? So I think a really important starting point, going back historically, is that before Islam, gender relations were incredibly diverse across the Middle East and North Africa. So southern Mesopotamia, one of the oldest civilizations in the world, was certainly extremely patriarchal. Seclusion and veiling marked respectability. It was mandatory. Veiling was mandatory for high status Assyrian women, but explicitly prohibited for slaves and prostitutes. Under Zoroastrianism, a third of religious sins concerned female sexuality. But outside Persia, that wasn't the case. In ancient Egypt, women had equal rights under the law. Queen Zenobia of what is now Syria led 70,000 men into battle against the Roman Empire. The Amazigh revered female leaders like the goddess Tanit, warrior queen Tinhanan, and military commander Dia. And we were just talking about the Hand of Fatima. Now, the oldest or the earliest origins of the Hand of Fatima, a protective female force, are dated back to ancient Carthage. So that, to me, whether the Hand of Fatima on jewelry and doorways, suggests that in ancient Carthage and more broadly, women were once recognized as a guard, as a fighting force. Okay, but then, after the Arab Islamic conquests, female seclusion became increasingly normative across the entire Middle East and North Africa. And my reading of the evidence suggests this is due to three institutional features that were carried by Islam, originating in pre-Islamic Arabian and Mesopotamian influences. And that's patrilineal tribalism, religious authoritarianism, and gender segregation as an expression of piety. So let me go through each one of those. So, importantly, Islamization entailed Arabization for the most part, but I'm going to talk about an important exception to that. So adoption of the customs from the Arabian Peninsula that predated Islam, but may have been baked into the religion at its birth. So conquered peoples only gradually converted to Islam. It took hundreds of years in Egypt, in fact, and they adopted the Arabic language, especially in Egypt. And as part of that cultural assimilation, they also adopted tribes and cousin marriage. And to this day, cousin marriage remains especially high in Muslim majority countries that were originally part of the Umayyad Caliphate. That close-knit patrilineal kinship was cemented by Sharia law because this recognizes, one, succession down the male line, that men own children, the male agnates inheritance, so that uncles, or at least in Sunni law, that uncles, etc., can inherit, they're not in Shia law, paternal ownership of children, and men's easy access to divorce. So paradoxically, patrilineal kinship was also reinforced by the Islamic stipulation of female inheritance rights. Kin marriage kept wealth in the family while also consolidating fraternal solidarity and shared honor. What was also incredibly important was the Persian influence. So the Persian theologians managed state institutions of learning when Iraq was the seat of the Sunni Muslim empire. And they transmitted, they being like Ghazali, for example, transmitted Mesopotamian and Zoroastrian influences to Islam. And these clerics, and there's a wonderful book which I strongly recommend by Zara Ayubi, these clerics conceived of men as intellectually superior and rightful patriarchs who achieved ethical perfection by secluding women. And they repeatedly barred women from communal prayers in the mosques. So throughout the 12th century, Damascus and also Korean women did defy these prescriptions, but they were increasingly discouraged and increasingly required to emphasize gender segregation. So let me give an example from Morocco. So Ibn Tumait was a Moroccan scholar who traveled across the Muslim world, and he studied under Ghazali. Now, when he came back to Morocco with Ghazali's ideas, he was pushing for an extremely puritanical form of Islam. So he and his followers, his supporters, were trying to break down liquor shops, were trying to force women to veil, tried to push for gender segregation. And interestingly, the Muslim clerics in Fez and in Marrakesh actually debated with him, and they opposed his ideas. They thought he was too puritanical. And Ibn Tumait, Ghazali's pupil, was actually exiled from Fez, exiled from Marrakesh, and I think flogged 14 times. So you can see that this more puritanical influence came. I mean, Ibn Tumait subsequently inspired the Almohad movement, which subsequently became the ruling dynasty. But you can see initially that Persian, that Ghazali influence was seen as too puritanical. In fact, Ibn Tumait struck the caliph's sister in the street because she was not veiling. So this is a conflictual process. This idea of Persian influence was a conflictual process that did not just happen with the dawn of Islam, but with a particular interpretation that was shaped through conquest, etc. Okay. So the pre-Islamic custom of veiling and secluding women to mark status, as occurred in southern Mesopotamia, it was given a new lease of life by slavery in the Islamic period. As Islam banned the enslavement of Muslims, there was an expansion of the slave trade from outside the empire. And women veiled to differentiate themselves from slaves. Like, I am a high status woman, those are the slaves. I am marking my respectability. And men also marked their respectability by veiling their female kin. And those female slaves also displaced Muslim women as domestic workers. So that made it very difficult for a low-skilled woman to get a job, right? If all the female slaves are already doing the domestic work that in Europe would have been done by poor white women, right? So as a result of both Islamization and Arabization, male honor became contingent on the propriety of female kin. And so the economic advantages of female wage labor were always outweighed, or predominantly outweighed, by the inevitable stigma, suspicion, and social ostracism. So Muslim patrilineal clans preferred to maintain purity and lineage prestige by female seclusion. So even when factories opened in the Ottoman Empire, Middle East and North African women tended to remain in home-based production, in weaving carpets, in ateliers under the eyes of male kin. Because, and this is what they call the patrilineal trap, that few families wanted to stick their neck out to be the unusual ones with their daughter working because she might be perceived as uniquely promiscuous. And so the unwillingness of families to deviate from that norm unilaterally created this negative feedback loop, that no one wanted to be the odd one out, so no one stepped out. So you maintain this equilibrium, which I call the patrilineal trap. Now, another important factor, and here I'm really borrowing from Ahmet Kuru's wonderful work, is that open debates were suppressed by religious authoritarianism. Military rulers maintained their legitimacy by rewarding loyal clerics with income, funding mosques and madrasas, and that alliance between state and clergy really inhibited independent critique. And so many families continued to be locked into a culture of deference to clerics who reinforce female seclusion with warnings of divine punishment. And in fact, in Egypt, there are many cases that when there was a famine or a flood or some sort of natural disaster, it was blamed on women's terrible behavior. And there was, you know, various warnings or telling women to stop going outside and be more pious so that we don't get more natural disasters. You know, if the price of bread went up, then women were punished and told to be more pious. Okay, so now let me summarize so far. So we're talking about the heterogeneous region becoming more patriarchal. Now let's come to the 20th century. The confrontation with European modernity provoked debates among the elites, at least, about women's place in society. And as men became more educated, they increasingly valued female education to create good wives and mothers. And that's a global trend. Every single country, Japan, Latin America, whatever, educated men, good wives and mothers who are educated. Now, clerics, especially in Iran, denounced girls' schools as un-Islamic. Feminists fought back. They published in journals in Beirut, in Cairo, in Tehran. Women debunked men's narratives. They decried imprisonment, and they highlighted scriptural support for equality. The Quran itself, as everyone here I'm sure knows, that the Quran itself addressed men and women equally. There is lots of scriptural support for gender equality, and many of these 1920s feminists highlighted this, and they rebelled against male interpretations of the Quran. Now, ambitious leaders in the Middle East and North Africa sought to catch up with Europe, and they embarked on a top-down economic modernization and societal transformation. So Ataturk, his 1926 law recognized women as equal citizens with equal entitlement to inherit and act as witnesses in court. But even though Ataturk introduced these legal reforms, that did not lead to any kind of feminist revolution for two main reasons, I think. Number one, state control and suppression of independent associations meant that ideological change did not reach the masses. So even though, you know, middle-class women in Istanbul benefited from that sort of secular enclave, it did not get all the way to Anatolia. Liberalism was confined to a small elite with little independent critique of the traditional ideologies in the wider society. And the other problem was that growth remained low, so there were few economic opportunities for women in Konya or whatever. Now, towards the 1970s, modernization became discredited by economic stagnation and the inability to defeat Israel. And here I'm really focusing on Egypt. In Egypt, clerics increasingly, and when I discuss the Islamic revival in the 1970s, in my own reading, I noticed two slightly different pathways, and Turkey is on one and Egypt seems to be on another. And we can discuss that later in the questions. Anyway, sorry. So in Egypt, clerics equated modernity with a rejection of Islam, and they declared the economic and military failures of the state to be punishment from the West. So Islamic preachers called on men to restore order and piety with female seclusion, and frustrated graduates, you know, who'd been to university, who'd benefited from this authoritarian social compact, but then struggled to find employment, struggled to find white-collar work, they found solace in religion. And many ordinary people in Egypt also found the Muslim Brotherhood supportive because they found social services and righteous purpose. And then we also have the Iranian Revolution, and that inspired hope for many in the possibility of political Islam. So there was a mushrooming of Quranic reading groups, publishing houses, cassette tapes, missionaries, mosques, all of these proliferated across the Middle East and North Africa, financed partly by Saudi Arabia. Now, here is where I notice a slight Turkish difference. So whereas in Egypt, it was the frustrated graduates who turned to the Muslim Brotherhood, in Turkey, I see a slightly different pathway in that it's the Islamic revival was strengthened by rapid economic development because it was economic liberalization that enriched and empowered a flourishing, independent, but socially conservative bourgeoisie, which funded its own religious media and schools. And as the AKP triumphed in elections, it quadrupled state spending on religion. So I think in Turkey, it was growth and the liberalization, the unleashing of the Anatolian tigers, which meant that their ideologies which were already more conservative then gained economic and political weight. So that's the Islamic revival in 2 minutes. Okay, now the big question is, has the Islamic revival slowed progress towards gender equality? Yes, I think. Political elites who might otherwise be open to reform are intimidated by potential backlash from clerics. So Middle East and North African states seek legitimacy by appealing to Islam, and restrictions on Islamist parties were loosened. There was more funding for mosque construction, for religious media and religious schools, and male guardianships laws remain in place across many countries of the Middle East and North Africa, though less so in the Maghreb, and I'll come to that later. So in this environment of mass religious revival, especially before the Arab Spring, preachers lambasted women for defying God's law, and those voting for Islamist parties are typically much less concerned about gender equality. And as a result, zealots are emboldened. So zealots harass women with impunity for what they're wearing. In Algeria, maybe the most extreme case, Islamists instilled fear by killing female teachers, raping journalists. And when Moroccan women petitioned for reform of the religious family law, they were harassed and condemned as anti-Islamic Western stooges. Repression likewise persists in Iran through morality squads and state-controlled media. Gangs of youth patrol Cairo's streets as they leer and lecture at women and snitch on them, telling their family and their kin what they're up to. And so many women who might otherwise not veil end up veiling to avoid harassment, or they retreat entirely from public view. So in some cases, the veil is a strategic device to protect one's reputation and try to minimize some of that harassment. So then we have another negative feedback loop, that as liberals self-censor to avoid aggression from religious radicals, patriarchal beliefs go unchallenged in public. So for all the Moroccan feminists who might otherwise speak out, who might otherwise express their critique, as they remain silent, potential allies remain invisible. And so that invisibility reinforces people's pessimism about the possibility of social change, and yet more women remain silent. So never hearing dissent, some Iranian and Iraqi women still believe that it's a sin to refuse sex with your husband. Now, having discussed the cultural and religious influence, I also want to emphasize another crucial part of why the patrilineal trap persists, and that's the structure of Middle East and North African economies. So, and this is, there's heterogeneity again, but for the most part, Arab economies, Middle East and North African economies are segmented into insiders, cronies who benefit from state largesse, and precarious outsiders. So insiders benefit from state protection, contracts, subsidies, licenses, and land. Outsiders remain trapped in precarious employment. And this has enormous economic effects, which have been well documented. It retards private sector job creation, because those who are guaranteed state protection don't need to innovate, don't need to adopt new technologies, don't need to hire meritocratically, because they already know they have a dominant market share. Whereas those small firms who are persistently harassed by the state are in an upward struggle, they don't grow. And so all their ideas and innovations and talents and brilliance struggles to expand, struggles to flourish. And importantly, this has two important impacts on gender. Well, maybe three actually. One, those firms remain small and family-based. So employment people's economic lives continues to be rooted in their families. Two, jobs are very few. Three, as a result of that, wasta. Wasta remains imperative, which reinforces the importance of kin. So Arabs continue to rely on wasta, these social connections which are necessary to access jobs, secure permits, avoid trickery, who can I go to, who can I trust for this and that, and resolve conflicts. So even middle-class professional Jordanians, doctors, lawyers, acquire social insurance from their kin. And loyalty to kin is also culturally esteemed. Growing up, girls are taught to put their families first above narrow self-interest. And so to maintain this wasta, to maintain this inclusion in these vital family networks, girls and men, women and men, must adhere to dominant social norms. So that means maintaining family honor. So in Persian, that is abaru. Maybe I'm mispronouncing that. And that's easily damaged by rumors of female impropriety. And fear of exclusion from those economically vital wasta networks motivates families, especially brothers, to police their female kin. So here's a quote from a woman in Iraq. She said, "I love my mother, but she worried so much about our reputation and always warned us about this or that. It seems that all she had to teach us was how to protect family honor." So there's really just relentlessly reminding girls about protecting family honor. So as a result of these things, Middle East and North African families remain for the most part in the patrilineal trap, that female wages are too low to compensate for the loss of male honor. And so women remain at home with little autonomy or social networking. Whereas men are free to forge new connections, run family firms, gain knowledge of the wider world, become trusted authorities, navigate through city streets. And there's and I can share the link if anyone's interested. There's a new survey from Images, which is across the Middle East and North Africa. Young men in North Africa are no more egalitarian than their grandfathers. They poll young men on a number of indicators of gender equality, like what men should do, what women should do. It's precisely the same for men in their 20s and men in their 60s. Zero social change. And I would suggest that is because female employment has remained persistently low. Nearly all men in North Africa, whether that's Egypt, Morocco, see men as superior political leaders. And although pious women have been integral to the Islamist outreach in both Turkey and Egypt, Islamist women have been absolutely key, the leadership remains very male-dominated and very patriarchal. So even though women are absolutely vital, absolutely active, the leadership still remains patriarchal. And a further factor inhibiting women's movements is sexual harassment. And I strongly believe that I don't think this is talked about enough. In Cairo, men lecture women with impurity. Some of my Moroccan friends, they tell me, walking from home to university, I'll get sexually harassed 5 times in a day, just in that morning. And these men are making sexually explicit remarks, grabbing, groping, stalking strangers in the streets. And as a result, young women feel anxious, ashamed, petrified about what onlookers might say. Even if they're attacked, they might remain quiet because they know, victims know, that it's them as the victim who will be blamed. What was she wearing? Where was she going? What time was it? And the presumption that women must have invited sexual aggression through indecent dressing or other behavior fuels this vicious cycle in which male relatives fear a loss of honor and prefer to seclude women. So men are concerned about their honor. They think that sexual harassment is rampant in the streets, and so they seclude women. But the more that women are secluded, the harder it is, of course, to challenge that sexual harassment. So again, another vicious cycle. And so for this reason, Turkish businessmen in Konya, for example, are reluctant for their wives to work as traders, selling pistachios, meeting all different people across the country, because there is rampant sexual harassment. Turkish men would be much more reluctant to their wives working in a small firm with unrelated kin, because who on earth knows what will happen there and what rumors might spread about what happened when she's working with a couple of men behind closed doors. Okay. Now let me give a more upbeat story, And I think that the best evidence for an upbeat story actually comes from Turkey. Because female employment does rise if the economic returns to women working outweighs the loss of family honor. So before COVID, Turkey experienced maybe 2012 to 2018, especially, Turkey had rapid economic growth and female employment soared, right? Turkey was on the upward U. the upward U. And we also saw that in the Maghreb, where there were labor-intensive industries. We also see that in Kuwait, where there's been labor nationalization, stipulating that firms, public firms and private firms, must hire Kuwaiti people. Same in the UAE, that they must hire Emirati people. There are these labor indigenization quotas. You have to have, say, 30% of managers must be Kuwaiti. So they run out of skilled men and they start hiring Kuwaiti and Emirati women. Economic growth is the biggest catalyst of female employment that holds across the world, and it definitely holds in the Middle East and North Africa as well. And public sector work also has this same effect, and it's preferred by Middle East and North African women because it's seen as safe and respectable. In fact, Assad has showed that when public sector contraction usually means a loss of female jobs. And importantly, when women seize jobs in paid work in the public sphere, they gain self-esteem and they socialize more broadly. So for example, a woman might spend her, okay, so it's Ramadan now, yes? I know families where, women can prepare the iftar, spend, many, many hours preparing a delicious, delicious meal, present it to her family, and not one person says, thank you, or well done, or this is delicious. But that labor is taken for granted. Her work as a housewife is not recognized, is not esteemed. But when women go out into the public sphere, they meet new women. They gain new ideas. They gain new friendships outside the family. They can find inspiration from what other women are doing. Someone else tells them their work is good. They feel valued. They feel appreciated. And so by socializing more broadly, gathering in cafes, bitching about the patriarchy, women come to collectively lambast and complain about the patriarchy and say, hey, that's not fair. Hey, we've done this. We should be recognized. Or here's this new opportunity. So definitely, I think there is huge potential with economic growth because it enables women to find jobs outside the home and then come to criticize patriarchy. Another really important driver is feminist activism. And again, Turkey is the best case for this, right? Feminists have campaigned for greater rights, autonomy, and protection. So the Turkish women's movement has campaigned against harassment, male violence, and virginity tests. Of course, they were most able to do this before 2016, when Turkey was part of the EU accession process and was trying to demonstrate its compliance with liberal ideas. But Turkey, it wasn't just like an EU-driven foreign agenda. There was a space that the Turkish women's movement seized and made their voice heard. And even when Turkey initiated legal reforms, which might just be a veneer for the EU, it was Turkish women's movements who made sure that they were enforced and better implemented and actually checked what was happening on the ground. And similarly in Morocco and Tunisia, activists have actually forced U-turns. In Morocco, in 2004, the Islamist party actually agreed to a reformed family code. And same in Tunisia, when the Ennahda suggested that women might be merely complementary, Tunisian women's movements came out in force and demanded a change. It was last year that Egyptian women managed a U-turn on regressive legislation. The Muslim Sisterhood has challenged ideologies of shame. So after the Arab Spring and sexual assaults, Muslim women in Egypt came out to challenge the Muslim Brotherhood, who told them they should be quiet when they were sexually harassed and assaulted. Another case is Rojava, the Kurdish liberation movement, where in Rojava, women are dismantling ideologies of male dominance, and they've achieved gender quotas. Saudi women are also publishing novels, sharing their ideas, sharing their worldviews. So there's this consistent trend across the region of challenging these male interpretations, collectively pushing for change. In Iran, women gathered to interpret scripture for themselves. Recently, they've been protesting against women's exclusion from stadiums, publishing magazines, petitioning the government. And there's, also there's Musawa, the global movement for equality in the Muslim family, challenging again male interpretations of the Quran. And I also appreciate, one of my great friends is Lebanese, and she shared with me this great Arabic Palestinian rap video decrying honor killings. So there is a huge, there are so many different examples we can point to where activism works. So this is what I want to say, that the patrilineal trap is not insurmountable because we know it can be challenged with growth and feminist activism. So those are reasons for optimism. And I also want to add a new, so earlier I made a point about heterogeneity. Now, one part of the Middle East and North Africa has more liberal laws, greater protection of gender equality, higher female employment, and also the first female prime minister in the Arab world. So that's Tunisia and Morocco, the Maghreb. And why is it that the Maghreb is more liberal, slightly more secular? In Tunisia, for example, I think people can even eat in the streets during Ramadan. It's not illegal, it's not repressed, there's tolerance of it. So why is that? Now, there are a couple of different theories. Is it, French colonialism brought in coeducational secular schools? Ali Marie Tripp has a book where she thinks that it's autocrats, they're seeking Western legitimacy by adopting a veil of reform to please Western donors. I don't find that persuasive because it's not just, number one, if NASA, for example, introduced these laws, there would be huge backlash in the streets. In Jordan, the king, the constitutional monarchy in Jordan, they tried to reform the family code. It was merely by raising the female age of marriage to 18 and saying that if a man wanted another polygamous wife, he was legally obliged to inform the first. So a very minor reform to the Jordanian family code, totally opposed by Islamists in parliament and also tribal leaders. So even if constitutional monarchs want to reform, they're very much limited by one, public sentiment, and two, the Islamists in power. But in Morocco, for example, the Islamist party actually endorsed a reformed family code. So why is the very western part of the Umayyad, what was then the Umayyad Caliphate, more liberal? My suggestion is the mountains. So in the Maghreb, in Morocco in the 1960s, for example, many people still spoke Amazigh. So there are 3 major Amazigh languages. So that tells us that the Arabization was not complete in the Maghreb. Many people actually disappeared into the mountains. So even though leaders might try to tax and control the people, many of the Amazigh retreated to the mountains. So the Arab influence was actually constrained by geography. And so what persisted was, one, the Amazigh languages, but also a slightly different culture. So I'm not saying that the Amazigh were ever like this, was ever a feminist utopia. These are patrilocal clans policing, guarding their areas of pasture, etc. But that, in my mind, is the most compelling explanation for why Morocco and Tunisia is slightly more liberal. It's the geography, the mountains enabled protection, enabled more cultural isolation rather than assimilation to those Arabic and Persian ideas, especially. So when Ibn Tumart, when the Umayyad dynasty came into power, many people remained culturally isolated. They continued to speak Amazigh and they continued their own practices, which didn't include, full veiling, for example. Okay, so with the exception of labor-intensive economic growth, with the exception of feminist activism, and with recognition of regional heterogeneity, Istanbul, Marrakesh, etc., for the most part, Middle East and North African feminists face an uphill battle because they continue to be restricted by patrilineal kin. They continue to be molested in male-dominated streets, condemned by Islamists, and repressed by authoritarians. So when El-Sisi cracked down on civil society, Egyptian women curtailed their campaign against sexual harassment. A Moroccan feminist, Bouchra Abdou, said, "I feel like we're in the bottom of a well. We keep screaming, but nobody hears us." So if I summarize, if you take one thing away, my reading of the evidence, and I welcome your critique, is to say that This region was once very heterogeneous, sometimes ruled by women, with evidence of female power and authority and freedoms. But it became and has remained much more patriarchal, thanks to the Arab Islamic conquests and Sharia law, which have cemented patrilineal kinship and religious authoritarianism. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Alice. You've given us so much to think about. Great. So now the floor is open for questions. So if you do have questions for Alice, I can either unmute you or please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Alice. It was a very fascinating talk. I enjoyed it very much. I have a question. First of all, you say it is a lot related to Islam. I am partly familiar with the Catholic norms, and as far as I know, the initial in the initial parts, it was similar to Islam in several ways, like how they treated women, how marriage was had to be permanent, and women also had to cover themselves. So I'm not so familiar. You should know better, I guess. But why did it diverge? I mean, Catholic, they had these reforms, it was changed, but if we think of that way, it is very likely that Catholic women were also suppressed, and excluding the, so there's also you also say there's also the reason because of the Arab culture, but Turkey was not under the Arab influence for a long time. I mean, it was the Ottoman Empire and they had a different culture, but still we see the influence of Islam. So, but considering Islam, because it pushes rules to women that they have to cover, I cannot see the difference between Catholicism and the Catholic countries and how they overcome those things, how women became more independent. But the Arab world and I mean particularly the Islamic countries couldn't go through that process. Can we say maybe it is because they are lagging behind, they didn't have these reforms, or is there any other reason to that?
Okay, that's a great question. I want to suggest, you know, this book, Coping with Defeat? I actually have it right here. It's by Jonathan Lawrence, Sunni Islam, Roman Catholicism and the Modern State. So that might be of interest. I was just using it as a prop for my laptop, so I had to take it out from underneath. Yeah, so, okay, let me highlight, yes, definitely Catholic countries, super conservative, super patriarchal. And I think another example is the Orthodox countries, right? The Russian Orthodox Church, extremely patriarchal. The whole of Eastern Europe, Greece, for example, extremely patriarchal. I would say one important difference might be that cousin marriage is much more prevalent in North Africa. And if you compare, for example, Jonathan Schultz and others and Henrik, they have a paper in Science where they show the share of cousin marriage across Italy and Spain and Turkey, for example. It's much, much higher in Turkey. And I know there's variation within Turkey, you know, it's like 1% in Istanbul, but much higher under the cloud. So cousin marriage does seem higher in areas that were once under the Umayyad Caliphate and remained Muslim. And that may be related to this issue of female inheritance and property rights, the fact that women could control their own property, that gave them the autonomy, that encouraged patrilocal kinship. And once you have cousin marriage, then I think that accentuated this honor culture, that men police their sisters in order to preserve their own name. So I think that's one important aspect of it in terms of gender. Then the Persian influence, I think, may have also increased the patriarchal aspect of Islam. And then I think the Jonathan Lawrence book is also important in terms of how Catholicism became slightly less, it talks about how Catholicism became more secular, how you had more secular enlightenments in Catholic countries and less so in Islamic countries. So I would suggest those three reasons: the cousin marriage, the interpretations of scripture, and the relationship with the state, I think. Thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you.
So Yeşim Hocam, please go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
First, I would, okay, and let me get this hand down. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and your energy and enthusiasm rubs on one and gets one's mind working. I would like to thank you and thank the organizers for bringing you here. Of course, I had the same question in my mind as the previous question that Unai asked. But more specifically, I have lots of questions. I mean, when you were talking, I had all these questions coming to my mind. But more specifically, I want to understand where you locate this causality. I mean, you span over such a long durée and over such a large geography. I wonder if this Islam in it. I want to buy it. I'm ready to buy it. I have Islamic conquest. It makes sense to me. But when you look at these different countries and in different time spans, how things change. There can be, it's not the Islamic conquest as such, but the answer you were just giving to Unai Tangaj, the interpretation of religion, or the particular institutions that existed that mediated this, this penetration of Islam in a certain way, or particular political preferences or ideological. I mean, Kurdish war is just it's the ideology. I mean, the Kurds in revolt needed women's inclusion in the fight, and there was that ideological trust that really worked, that did bring women out, and now Kurdish women are more politically visible, economically more important than they were before. So, and similar, you can make the argument in the Turkish case for different stages, and try to argue that there can be different causes at different stages of this Islamic conquest adoption by these societies. And the challenge, for example, in Turkey, institutional, there might be institutional causes. When you have mosques, 90,000 mosques, preaching that women should be kept at home, and the educational system not saying anything about it, or not being able to not having the resources, or not having the politics to, depending on which period of Turkey you're talking about. You can give different reasons for this economic employment. Feminist activism's challenge. I mean, in the Turkish case, I really don't think the feminist activism made much difference to employment. Not at all, in fact. I mean, they made a great difference in bringing out. They had two issues. They brought out this issue of domestic violence, and they made a big change in amendment of both the penal code and the civil code. But I don't think during AKP's time economic employment with growth grew substantially either. I mean, it's been, if anything, before development, Turkish Statistics Institute included women in agriculture as being employed, as being part of the labor force. And for that matter, Turkish women's employment rates were something like 35% in 1970s and even early. And they dropped to 20, during later times, and AKP's early years, especially as much as 27%. And we don't right now. Institute of Statistics is under hostage, and I don't know when I mean, you know, the statistics on women's employment too are liable to be, you know, just, you know, played around with to make things look good, the way everything is played around with in an authoritarian system. But, you know, we're talking about 30%, you know, 30% at most, you know. So not a big difference with feminist activism in Turkey, even though feminist activism has been very important, very crucial, as I said. You know, I was, so the upshot is, I mean, the causality might be different in different time, might it not be different for different time spans and different contexts, is my question. Big question. You addressed this big, important question, and you know, here's my question to you.
I think that pushes me to make an important clarification, and this is true for across the world. Economic growth drives up female employment. Feminist activism is specifically important for challenging ideas of violence, harassment, women's status, and political representation. So I don't think there's any evidence that female activism does much for employment. I totally agree with you. But Hatun and Weldon, they have a great paper, 2013, American Journal of Political Science, showing that countries with strong feminist movements tend to have more comprehensive government action, as laws, policies, spending, investments on violence against women. We also see the countries with feminist activism tend to have more female leaders. And so countries where women are repressed, like China and Russia, do not, even though they have high female employment. So just to clarify, so that was an important clarification. You also asked how I identify causality and all this. Well, you know, it's not like we were discussing earlier, you know, this isn't like a persistence paper that X happened in the past and therefore all these things happen. It's really, I think my approach, my methodology is just to piece together this mosaic, like building in different bits of evidence from all kinds of different sources, and then sort of applying comparative analysis to think, well, why did this happen here but not there? But thank you for making that make that important clarification. I really appreciate that. And I should have done that. So you are right to intervene. Thank you.
Hassan, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the very lively presentation. So I have one question, and but before that, I found this New Yorker piece. It's an old one from 2015, but when I read it, I immediately thought about you, because towards the end it talks about how the Chinese factory town they built in Egypt, expecting to employ low-wage workers and house them in dormitories, and women didn't come. They couldn't really go, and the families don't let them to go and work live in the dormitories. So that's why I really thought about it. You probably know it already because you read everything. But
no, I haven't read that one. You must send it to me. I did know. Thank you. But you know, it's the same. It's the same. When they opened the factory, in Bursa, in the 1920s, women wouldn't come. No. They only managed to get people to, and the wages, they wouldn't come, and they only managed to get more women to come when it had sort of been sanctioned by local clerics. They really had a difficult problem attracting women workers. You're absolutely right. I hadn't read that, so thank you.
Yeah, 21st century. So it's like, anyway, my question is really, do we need to go all the way back to the early Islamic period to explain the heterogeneity of Tunisia and Morocco and maybe Turkey? Like they are different mores. Maybe like this is related to Yeşim Hoca's question that maybe the really differentiating reasons are closer by, like they have Atatürk, like at least Tunisia, from what I know, have like modernizers, and these are the three countries most closest ties with the West. So maybe So I think you were actually arguing for this effect on modernizers. What made you change your mind? I think that's my question. And I also want to, I think I agree with you instead of Yeşim Hoca in terms of the employment numbers, because really the important thing about the female employment is not the overall female employment, but the wage employment. So the decline in employment since 1970s all the way to 2005 in Turkey is due to exit of unpaid family workers from the labor force, and actually the paid employment of women has been increasing continuously. This is starting from very low base, like 5% in 1980s, but it is increasing. So I agree with you in terms, and this is, the trends are very long term. It's not a recent data manipulation. So that's all I want to mention.
Okay, so let me address the point that how do I know it's not the Arab modernizers? Okay, let me give 3 pieces of evidence. One, Algeria, northern Algeria, in Kabylie, the region, people organized under a woman to resist French colonization. So she was born in 1852. This woman, she organized people, followed. So there's evidence of, recent evidence of female leaders in the Amazigh culture, in the Amazigh society, predating these Arab modernizers. Second point is, if we look at nationally representative surveys of attitudes, we find that even in rural areas, so that's not places that are affected by Western influence in Casablanca, not areas influenced by whatever the rulers are doing, but in rural areas, people in Morocco are much more gender equal than people in Egypt, than rural people in Egypt. So I think those 3 points, and also, yeah, and I think also is a really important point is that if you look at factory work in Tunisia and Morocco, women go to the factories, women work in the factories in Casablanca's industrial zone. There are women working there, working for a low wage. And this isn't because of any legislation by government. I mean, the only legislation is like, permitting women's greater access to divorce, or permitting women, or legislation on raising the age of marriage. And much of that legislation has been highly criticized as poorly implemented. So yes, it's true that some of these modernizing leaders introduced egalitarian laws, but that hasn't had a major impact on society. These are not strongly enforced by the courts. And so, yeah, so let me summarize. Even before the modernizing rulers, there was evidence that the Maghreb was more gender equal. Today, female employment is higher in the Maghreb, and that cannot be related to the laws, and through the laws are poorly enforced, so they cannot have much influence on society. So I appreciate your counter, but I don't think it's supported.
Aydın, please.
Okay, thank you. I think I unmuted my microphone, so you hear me, right?
Perfectly.
Thanks. Okay. Dr. Evans, thanks for the presentation. Actually, as a political scientist, I'm interested in the political aspect of the causal mechanism that you introduced. And actually, it reminded me of the causal mechanism pointed out by Munira Charat in her seminal work on women's rights in Maghreb, actually. The antagonism between reformist political elites and potential backlash from the society, right? So that is the main dynamic that explains the variation to a great extent at national level, right? So that is one thing. And the mechanism that we are familiar with, that we are all familiar with, tells us that these reformist elites are inclined to implement a series of reforms for the betterment of women's rights and women's status, but out of fear from some backlash from the society, they actually don't do it, right? Yeah. So the reforms remain partial. So we do not have a full-blown transformation in women's status. So my question is this: when we think of a backlash and when we portray the picture based on that antagonism, reformist elites and traditional society, do we see some kind of increase or betterment in women's status as the time goes by? I mean, what I want to say is that if these reformist elites are willing to implement these reforms, do their chances increase as their political power stabilize over time? So that is my question. So if they are willing to implement these reforms, and if they see that they have some kind of political authority for decades, for instance, their chances for implementing these reforms, does that increase really?
So which would be the period where leaders have had the chance to implement their reforms without the backlash? So for example, when Yemen was under communist rule, we saw political reform. Simply in Central Asia, when they had the ability to coercively, under Stalin, implement these reforms, yes, they did so. But I think we see that as long as the Islamists have gained power and gained strength, then there's a negative correlation with leaders' abilities to push through these reforms. And I think perhaps what one possible example I get going to Tunisia is when people, there's some people supported the Islamist party and because they saw it as a protest vote against corruption, they were frustrated with Ben Ali. But then they increasingly realized, and this comes up in numerous surveys, they lost faith in the Islamists. And people started to think, all these politicians are the same, there's no difference. And after that period, there was some scope for feminist activism, which is now, clearly in jeopardy. I'm trying to think of a period we could point to where the governments haven't faced that strong Islamist background. I think the best case, and I can point you to a nice comparative paper by Amy Young, where she compares the Jordanian family code with the Moroccan one and the reforms, and shows that it was more possible in Morocco, where the Islamists were weaker.
80s might be a suitable decade, I guess, right? Because it's been more than 2 decades after the state formation and nation building process was underway, and there was no potential threat as they had some kind of authoritarian grasp, and they had the chance to control the society efficiently across Maghreb at least. So that might be a period.
But I think there were many people who were frustrated with I think my impression would be there were many people who were frustrated with poor economic outcomes, and there's, the leaders had a tenuous grasp on power.
So they had new challenges. So that is
yes, exactly.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Emel Hocam.
All right. Thank you. I just wanted to. Are you from the UK, Alice?
Yes.
All right. Okay. I mean, just knowing the UK academia, I was just wondering. I mean, when you compare patriarchy, UK academia is so patriarchal. So I was just wondering, and in general, the UK workplace for women. So I was just wondering if you put these in perspectives. But my question is, I had a bit of a problem with your presentation. I found it a bit too civilizational, a bit essentialist, because I teach on the gender, society, politics in the Middle East, and since years. And I know that type of explanation for authoritarianism, for instance, backwardness is always, used to be put on Islam, Arab culture, oil, and all that in the 80s. I wonder if now, later, it was so much challenged by critical scholars, these type of essentialist explanations for authoritarianism and patriarchy. I mean, you have great scholars, Fatma Bernisi, Mona Atya, Lila Abulugut, Nicola Prat, Hanan Aw, and then all these, they have challenged, they brought it kind of a different dimension. So I'm just really wondering what happened. Are we now with this Ukrainian crisis going back to these civilizational essential explanations about cultures? I'm a little bit perplexed because how do you define patriarchy in general? Patriarchy, I have spent 20 years of my life in the Western academia, and patriarchy is everywhere. If you just patriarchy, it's not just because the women are there. The women, by working or finding employment, it doesn't mean that they are actually really challenging the patriarchy out there, and the leadership processes or the promotions. How many professors, female professors, are there in the UK? And here, for instance, recently, and you have never questioned about for instance, the capitalist economy and how this actually has an impact. You go back to the Arab culture, the Islam and all that. Recently, there was a thing that was published by World Intellectual Property Organization, and the countries with the most female inventors in the world. First is Cuba, second is Philippines, third Portugal, Romania, Spain, China, then comes US, UK, Germany, and Japan. So there is so much of patriarchy closely linked with capitalism, and this is a problem for women's development in the Western world, for instance. And this hasn't been challenged. I mean, not to engage with these things. And also, the female, the activists in Iran, in Turkey, in the Arab world, have been very much influenced by socialism, by the workers' movements. I mean, it was very strong. And then later, for instance, the rise of Islam also has a kind of a socio-economic explanation. So it's not only just cultural, or it's not only just Sharia or things like that. And there's so many, for instance, the Palestinian resistance was so female-oriented. I mean, if you look at the 1960s, 70s, and you had these female militants, you had these you had these great also intellectuals, women intellectuals in the Arab world. They weren't Berbers, they were Arabs, yet they were quite, they have contributed a lot. For instance, also in Iran, even in the Islamist revolution, after the Islamist revolution, for instance, in Iran, you have female taxi drivers who also drive men. You don't have this in the UK, for instance. You have a lot of female engineers. You don't have a lot of female engineers in the UK. You have a lot of film directors, for instance, women in film industry, such things. I mean, not to question things, I found a little bit, I mean, I'm really interested in your data. What type of, are you a historian? Did you do field work? How many people did you speak with? What's your real data? I mean, to put these things and then to say, okay, there's this patriarchy. So that's the Arab culture, is the Sharia, and it's authoritarianism. I found this quite a reductionist explanation. I'm sorry to say this, but I was a little bit disturbed by such, because I have been teaching and I have been working in Tunisia. Tunisia, for instance, the Islamists, I don't know if you know, when the Islamists came to power in Ennahda, they had a huge number, high number of female representatives in the parliament. They had even the higher number of representatives in the parliament than the secularists. There is an Islamic feminism. And then Tunisia has always been, it's not just because the Berber culture or whatever, the Tunisian women were always present in the social life. Yes, I'm not sure the employment really explains everything. Just because there are more women working in the UK, for instance, I mean, to be very honest, we were speaking with a lot of female colleagues, Turkish colleagues in the UK. Every one of them, the youngest ones, were saying that it's so separated. I mean, there's so much patriarchy in UK academia. Whereas, for instance, the social sciences in Turkey are so much female oriented, and you can breathe here. Whereas I'm from the politics, in the politics department in the UK, it's so male oriented, white male oriented. So these things I think need to be just, so I was just wondering, yes, I'm just really wondering about your methods, data, and just this kind of, I find this essentialist take to this issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so let's first of all go through the descriptive data. So here I think we can look at female employment in the public sphere, whether women are mixing and mingling with people outside the household. So that is labor force participation, particularly in urban areas, in the public sphere. If we look at that, it is much lower in the Middle East and North Africa than elsewhere. We also need to consider gender wage gaps and people's share of senior managers. So women's share of senior managers across countries. We can also, so that's employment. We can also look at laws like male guardianship laws. Those are much more prominent and have remained much more prominent and more entrenched across the Middle East and North Africa. We can also look at representation in leadership, again, much lower in the Middle East and North Africa than elsewhere. We can also look at strength of feminist activist movements as coded by political science. So I think there are a number of indicators that we can look at where we have representative data and we have comparative data. So I find one, for example, is helpful is the World Economic Forum have the Global Gender Gap Index, and they take a wealth of this data, both in terms of labor force participation, pay gaps, position in the labor market, leadership, etc., share of STEM, etc., education, etc., and systematically all the Middle East and North African countries are lumped towards the bottom of that. And of course, there's heterogeneity. Qatar now has actually very high female employment, thanks to the labor indigenization laws I mentioned. But whatever indicator you look at, there is nationally representative data showing that the Middle East and North Africa is more patriarchal. I think the strongest critique you can make is maybe by saying, oh, well, Papua New Guinea has even higher rates of reported rape. Rape is incredibly high. Male aggression is incredibly high.
You're a quantitative scholar. You look at indicators.
No, I'm not a quantitative scholar. I'm saying those are nationally representative data which we can compare across countries. That is that. I think that's solid evidence of saying I'm just you asked me how I interpret what is patriarchy, and I'm saying we can look at female employment. Are women mixing and mingling? Are they gaining prestigious positions? We can also look at social attitude surveys. So we can look at the World Values Survey, for example, where they ask 3 important questions like, men are better political leaders. Do you strongly agree or not? Men have greater rights to a job. Do you agree strongly or not? Boys and girls should have equal right to education. If you look at those indicators, again, the Middle East and North Africa emerges as much more patriarchal of every country. So whether you're looking at the female employment, whether you're looking at leadership, whether you're looking at legislation upholding male guardianship, or whether you're looking at attitudes, all those quantitative indicators that are nationally representative and comparative, the Middle East and North Africa appears much more patriarchal. So I think it would be hard to claim that the UK, which has had 2 female leaders, which has far higher share of female representation in parliament, far higher share of female managers. Now, this isn't a defense of the UK. All these countries are on a patriarchal spectrum, right? All, in every country in the world, men are dominating parliaments, companies, workplaces, spaces of leisure, and they're not doing their share of the housework. So no one is saying, I'm not saying I'm in the UK and I'm living in some feminist fantasy, right? So this is just a comparative question. Now, you make a point saying it's essentialist. Maybe it would help me if you said which aspects you found essentialist or what you mean by
you're putting at the end, your conclusion is the Arab culture. It's the Arabs, not even the Berbers, it's the Arabs. I mean, how can you, this is quite a very essential.
If you're saying something's essentialist,
it's like saying civilizational. There is nothing as such. I mean, there's so many things that explains the culture, that explains what happened. And also, not all these countries have started the race at the same moment, right? These countries have been colonized, have been exploited, and still there's economic exploitation, racial exploitation, and also there is all sorts of hierarchy in the world politics. How can you just leave these aside and say it's the Arab culture that actually has led to this?
Okay, so 2 points there, just to make this clear. Number one, I don't think it's essentialist because they've highlighted massive cultural change. I'm saying in Turkey, there's been this huge rise of feminist activism and there's been this huge rise of female employment. And so I'm not saying there's any static culture. And also, I don't know if you were here for the beginning, but I specifically talked about this colonialism. Okay, so yes, colonialism generally impeded democratization and development, which are all bad for gender equality. No disagreement. But again, going back to the quantitative data, if you compare female employment and representation with countries of similar income, if we compare Algeria and South Africa, female employment is much, much higher in South Africa than Algeria.
So we compare, if employment means patriarchy?
So I'm saying so patriarchy is a broad nebulous term, and we can think that there are many different aspects of it. Okay. If we look at those composite indicators or any aspect of them, then we find that compared to countries with similar wealth, the Middle East and North Africa tends to score badly. Now that's not a static thing. It's not locked in. It can change. It does change. There's heterogeneity within every single country. Anyway, and it's not a cultural point, as I made my point about the structure of the Middle East and North African economy. So across the Middle East and North Africa, male youth unemployment is about 25%. So that means incredibly long job queues, and women are at the back of those job queues. So if employers prefer to hire men, and women just aren't getting a chance to find employment. So I repeatedly stress that it's also about the structure of Middle Eastern economies, which means that men are first in line for these long job queues. And as long as those job queues are so long, then women won't find work. But what changes is the rapid economic growth, especially labor-intensive industrialization. So I don't think I've ever suggested that colonialism doesn't matter. I've never suggested any essentialism. I totally agree that these things would change. So maybe so thank you for letting me reinforce and clarify those points.
May I? Okay.
Oh, wait, we would just say one thing about the capitalism and communism. Yeah, so on communism is absolutely the world's greatest top-down intervention for women's economic empowerment across communist countries. We see very high rates of female employment, China and Russia, Cuba, etc. But in the absence of feminist activism, there is low female representation, and limited government action on gender-based violence. You also raised the example. So I don't think so. So again, we have to break down what communist impact on different aspects of patriarchy. You also mentioned the Philippines with a high share of female innovators. Yeah, the Philippines has a matrilineal history where women have always moved freely in the public sphere, going back to the 10th century. Anyway, so just to come back to that point about socialism. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries at all. So I'd like to ask about something different. So I think a distinctive future, hopefully you agree, about the feminist movements in the past decade or so is the rise of the Islamic feminists, right? Because now these women in Turkey, for instance, in particular, in Egypt, I guess also in Pakistan, women who prefer to lead more socially conservative lifestyles, who prefer to have the veil on and so on, are also living so far, I think, the most liberal lifestyles ever, right? In the Turkish example, this has also been encouraged by the AKP, right? Because for political reasons, for once, they do care about the women, and from polls we know that a high percentage of women actually do vote for the Islamic Party, and they also have super strong women's branches and women's active groups. Now, so my question is this. Now, it seems that, so supposedly there should be this conflict between these two identities, right? So do they have to give up one for the other, for this lifestyle, to be a strong woman, to be independent, to work in jobs outside, to be maybe single, living alone, and so on. And it seems that these women are finding a way to reconcile these two identities. And my question is, do you think that this could break the patriarchy?
So what is but I think that I just wouldn't frame it in those ways. I wouldn't frame it in those ways. So yes, absolutely. There are Islamist women who are deeply religious and also want greater equality. And so these women are, for example, forming Quranic reading groups and showing scriptural support for equality. And that, I would say, is just one of many vehicles towards gender equality. And the extent to which there is feminist activism, the extent to which they're challenging discourses of shame, yes, absolutely, we would anticipate greater progress towards gender equality. They're pious, religious women all over the world, whatever their faith. There are Jewish women who are incredibly pious, incredibly religious, and yet they're interpreting their religion in a more egalitarian way, and they're pushing for reforms within the synagogue. So I personally wouldn't say there's much difference whether you wearing a scriptural hat or not. The broader point which I'm trying to emphasize is these catalysts within the society as a whole. So economic growth, feminist activism, rather than the identity of a specific person and how important their faith is to them, etc. That said, I think for the most part, we tend to see that secularization, meaning a process of questioning established traditions, questioning established hierarchies, becoming more tolerant and open-minded to different processes has often been important. So, for example, let me give the example, Latin America, where the church lost a lot of status and gravitas after many accusations of pedophilia, for example. This is going back to the question of Catholicism, right? So after the church lost status and with growing social media, urbanization, and criticism of the church, we've seen flourishing feminist activism. In Spain, also, after the church lost some of its authority and legitimacy with its association with Franco, we see flourishing feminist rebellion. So often the broader process of secular transformation, the questioning of hierarchies, has enabled feminists to flourish. That said, I would never say, being religious per se prohibits one from believing X or Y on gender. But thank you for letting me clarify that. Yeah, so totally lots of Islamic feminists. Yeah, sure.
Great. It's already almost 7:30, so let's maybe take, if there's anyone, last question, and then we can close the seminar. Great.
I have one more question, actually. So I was just curious. You didn't mention anything about the industrialization, how the economy is, how the structure of the economy in those countries, because usually what we see is, so there's a coincidence, but the Islamic countries are more located towards like southern parts, and they are more focused on agriculture. Whereas in the north, there was the Industrial Revolution, so there was the need for women employment. They were working in factories. How do you see the effect of the nature of work and the economy?
So I think where we see greater demand for labor, then female employment tends to grow. That is the general pattern that we see across the world. And so where we've seen labor-intensive industrialization in Morocco and in Tunisia and in Turkey, then female employment continues to grow. But female employment lags and remains small, I think, with the persistence of small family-owned firms, small family-owned farms. I mean, small family-owned, here is an example where actually gender may affect the direction of economic growth. As long as men can capitalize on women's unpaid labor, whether it's in family farms or the family carpet atelier or the family fields, then those small firms persist, and that in turn may slow some economic growth. But yes, where you have labor-intensive industrialization, we see a rise in female employment. But as long as wages in the Middle East and North Africa remain very high, too high, going back to Hassan's point, for rapid manufacturing, then there's a cap on what can happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for such a really lively discussion, and Alice, thanks a lot again for this excellent talk. Great, so have a very nice evening, and we will all be left with our thoughts, I think, after this wonderful seminar. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.